Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Amy Jaffe. Amy is a fellow in energy studies and director of the Energy Forum at the Baker Institute, and also the associate director of the Rice Energy Program. She does all of this at Rice University. Amy's research focuses on geopolitics of oil, strategic energy policy, and energy economics. She was formerly a senior editor for Petroleum Intelligence Weekly, which, as many of you know, is really very highly regarded publication in the oil and gas industry. She's widely published and has served as co-editor for two books. Energy in the Caspian Region, Present and Future, came out in 2002, and Natural Gas and Geopolitics, 1970 to 2040, that came out in 2006. And she's also co-author of a recent book that came out in 2010, Oil, Dollars, Debt, and Crises, The Global Course of Black Gold. She serves as a strategic advisor in the American Automobiles Association, and she's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She is a graduate from the Princeton University, and she's going to talk to us about geopolitical implications of shale gas. So let's welcome.
Well, thanks very much, Varun, and to the Energy Institute for inviting me. I welcome the opportunity to talk to you. I always ask the audience to raise their hand if they own a car. I do that so that when you get oriented toward the talk, so that you get oriented toward the fact that you have a car, that you cannot put electricity yet in your car, right? You have to put liquid fuel in your car, so that I want you to keep an open mind to my talk, remembering that you have a vehicle that can only run on liquid fuel, and that if we doubled the nuclear fleet in the United States, it wouldn't help you because your car cannot run on electricity. So just bear that in mind as I'm speaking about national security issues, because people tend to lose sight of that when they get into talking about other forms of electricity that could be very exciting in the future, but are not here and now being able to be a fuel for your car. So I always start with that so that we all get on the same page. So even though this talk is about shale gas and the geopolitics of shale gas, I feel like I have to put it in a context. And the context that I'm going to put it in is today's Middle East. So I shouldn't say we all watch CNN. Maybe some of us are watching other stations. But the bottom line is we're coming into TV every evening, and we're looking at the national or international news. And in any various period of time over the last 6-8 months, we've watched turmoil in a particular country. It's varied. Tunisia, Egypt, Syria seems to be the country du jour for the news media. But I think the thing that we want to remember in thinking about oil and thinking about the fact that we own an automobile is that the kinds of problems that Tunisia faced, or that you're seeing today in Syria and elsewhere, these kinds of problems exist throughout the Middle East, even for the wealthy countries that have oil. The kind of social problems, people's feelings about whether their government has legitimacy or not, whether they feel that they have personal rights and personal freedoms that are protected or not protected by the government, whether they think that they can be an arbitrary victim of the secret police, whether they believe that if they go to university and they come out of university, there will or won't be a job for them. I mean, let's not forget that the young man who lit himself on fire was distressed because he would both never have a job and he was hassled by the secret police. So these are problems that run across the Middle East. And so when the first events happened and the price of oil went up, it might have seemed a little irrational. You probably saw some commentary in the media about how it's not going to spread to oil-producing countries, and so therefore it's not relevant. Like the hedge funds are irrational having the price of oil go up. And I said at the time, no, I disagree. You have this political contagion effect. It's a real effect. And it will affect oil. And it doesn't have to affect oil by having there be a revolution in Saudi Arabia. We don't have to see the so-called quote-unquote Shah fall like you did in 1979. And I like to talk to my students about this by reminding them, if you go back and look in the history book, that those of us who were alive at the time, or adults and watching it in horror at the time, thinking about how we're not going to have gasoline, that we remember it as the Shah was a dictator. He was shooting his own people who were coming out into the streets. He fell from power, and then oil got cut off. And that's because your parents remember it that way. That's how you remember it. But that's not actually what happened. What actually happened was people came out in the streets. The Shah ordered the secret police and the military to shoot them. He did that night after night after night, like you're watching on TV in Syria. And then the oil industry of Iran decided that they were going to side with the people. And so they stopped providing fuel to the military and the police that were going to drive to shoot these students. And then there was a skirmish and a fight, and the oil industry walked off the job. And that cut off all oil production in Iran. And once all oil production in Iran was cut off, and the Shah had no support and no money, he fell. And that was the sequence of events. That could happen again today. In any country in the Middle East where the people who are working in the oil fields or working in the industry decide that they are not going to work for whatever reason, that is going to affect your ability to use your car. And let me just remind you, because you probably, for those of you who aren't in geopolitical studies, all of Saudi Arabia, or 90% of Saudi Arabia's oil, is produced in an area called the Eastern Province. That is where 70 or 80% of the population is of Shia faith, and they have been having riots that have not made it onto CNN, which you are not seeing. But it's a very good explanation, the simplistic explanation. I don't have that many minutes to go into it, but it's a simplistic explanation for why it was in Saudi Arabia's interest to roll across the border and shoot people in Bahrain, saying that they can't have self-government. Right? So again, when you watch the events in Bahrain, you're thinking, well, it doesn't connect to me, it doesn't connect to oil, it doesn't connect to my car. But that's why I start with this slide when I talk about what it means to have resources in the United States, because despite the challenges of having resources in the United States and the impact of developing those resources, we need to get a grip on how serious what's happening in the Middle East is for not only the future of the people in the Middle East, because we need to care about that, but we are actually more connected to it than we realize, and so I'd like to start the lecture by explaining that. And if you, because there's always this point when you go to do a lecture in an academic setting, there's always this prove your point. So just to show you what happened with the spot market price for the Brent crude oil, you can see how much the price went up around the Libyan Day of Rage. And it's not just because Libya's oil got cut off, because that oil was replaced by strategic reserves and by Saudi Arabia increasing their production. But again, it's this whole atmosphere of what is all this going to mean for the energy market. So I'm just going to rush through a few slides just to sort of make a basic point, right? Let's say that across the Middle East, what comes in 5 years is all good. Let's say that young people come out into the streets. We get a much more freer society. We get people who want to run their government in a way that benefits the population and not just a few narrow dictators, right? Perhaps, hopefully over time, it might be a more peaceful setting to how societies organize themselves. Could be all good. But the bottom line is the sort of lesson of oil, and we're doing a new study on this and trying to, sort of show it econometrically. But the sort of anecdotal lesson of oil is you change my government and the production goes down. And I just show you a few pictures. Gaddafi came in. Gaddafi was, we all see him as sort of a crazy guy now, but when he came in, he was sort of a Democrat and wanting to have a populist, revolution to help the people. And, his helping the people caused oil production to collapse. And my point, which I like to show, is that, this happened. Gaddafi came in 69, and let me tell you how long the Arab awakening, Arab Spring might last, because he came in on a wave of Arab nationalist socialist sentiment that was started in Egypt in 1952. It wasn't quite it didn't become that right in 52, but by 54, that was the movement. And Gaddafi rode that wave and came in 69. So it's 18 years later. So the Arab Spring is not something that's going to happen for 2 years and then it's going to be off CNN and you're not going to have to worry about it anymore. Because these trends in history in the Middle East, we're talking about a long change of political trend. So Gaddafi came in 69. You will notice that before their production went to zero, because he said he was going to make a river of blood with his population, they had never come back to the 3.5 million barrels a day they could produce before he came in. Oh, my line's missing on Iraq. Same thing. If you look at the peak for Saddam Hussein, in 79 he came in, they were at 3.5. Again, they never really got back to that number. If you look down here for Iran, Khomeini came in, they've never gotten back to that number. They used to be able to actually, they never weren't producing flat out then. They used to be able to produce over 6 million barrels a day. Now they're at about 3. Soon to be less than that. Democracy, not good for oil, right? Soviet Union collapses, they become more democratic. Putin comes in, they start to be able to rebound their oil production, right? So I'm not saying that there's a causal connection, but it's anecdotally connected, and some people are working on maybe the causes of I don't want to make a statement about the causes because it's not sort of statistically shown. Same thing. Chavez came in 1998, the line is going down. Mexico became a much fuller democracy. Calderon's elected line's going down, right? And part of it has to do in a society where everybody has a say in a voting way or through a free media or so forth. Some one guy who's the head of the national oil industry can't just turn around and say, we're going to spend $50 billion refurbishing the following oil field instead of building roads and schools. I mean, you can understand just thinking about it. And then the second thing is, you live in the United States. You know how the Secretary of Energy gets picked. It's political, right? Would you really want, I shouldn't insult him because he's such a good Secretary of Energy, but would you really want Stephen Chu to be in charge of your gasoline supply and run the entire refining industry and oil production system for the United States, being a political appointee by the president? No, that would not be effective, but that is how it is in most countries. So if we're changing the president and we're changing the oil minister and we're changing the head of the national oil company, it's highly disruptive. So in Kuwait, for example, they have been saying they're going to do something to invest to expand their oil production since 1991 when they went to a democracy, but they keep changing the government every 6 months, a year. The emir has to dissolve the parliament. They have to have an election again. So they've changed the head of the national oil company like 10 times in the last 5 years. So they can't get a plan. And to build major infrastructure, you have to be able to implement a complex plan. And so my theme tonight is, the chances are the Arab Spring is going to mean lower production from the Middle East. Could mean a crisis, like, oil workers walk off the job somewhere, there's rioting that stops oil production somewhere, and then you're going to get a coupon for how much gasoline you can use this week. And I'll be in a better place because I have a hybrid car, right? But and I live 5 blocks from my place of work. But for the rest of you who are actually commuting from some distant place, you're going to be in a bad place, right? And you can see the sort of variation for OPEC in terms of, the highs and lows of what people have projected that they may be able to produce or not be able to produce, over the next 5 years as demand, hopefully the global economy recovers. It's like, where's the oil going to come from? So before, when people said, well, where's the oil going to come from, the answer would have been no place. We're going to pay more, right? So the interesting thing about the Shale Revolution, and I don't use the word revolution loosely because it's going to be a really dramatic, transformative change for the industry. So in natural gas, it's very easy to see, right? We had this view that we'd run out of natural gas in the United States. You've probably heard the term peak oil before, right? We've used all the easy gas. We know where it was. It's over. We don't have any supply. And companies went out and built these giant terminals so that we could liquefy natural gas from the Middle East or from West Africa and we could ship it here to the United States, regasify it, and use it in industry and homes and so forth, right? And we built a lot of terminals up the East Coast and down here on the Gulf Coast. And all of a sudden, that's changed. So this was the view of the world, just to give you a picture, where this is a satellite photo of the globe at night, so where the lights are on, that's where the white is, right? And where these distant resources were, FSU, Middle East, South America, was far away from where the lights were going to be on, and so we were imagining a world with lots of, the slogan is liquefied natural gas, so LNG, so where you're going to have thousands of LNG tankers, just as we do today in oil, moving the oil around, we were going to have these tankers of gas moving the gas around, and that looked like it was going to be the world, and we were going to have, most of our natural gas was going to come from tankers the way it also does from oil, and then voila, right? Suddenly we realize we have this natural gas in a shale formation, which is basically imagine just solid rock. And we have the technology to produce it. And where's it located? It's located right where the lights are on. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how having the natural gas be exactly where the lights are on really changes geopolitics dramatically. So the first dramatic change, and we have a computer simulation we use at Rice where we have all the reserves in the world logged into the computer, and we have a demand forecast going out 40 years for how much demand is going to change in every major place they use natural gas. And we have cost curves for what gas is most competitive to what demand center. And the computer, after 4 days of spinning around, the computer tells you what is the optimum solution over a 40-year period and back again. So the computer makes investments based on what is most commercial, what would be most profitable for a company that was investing in those resources. And what it shows is that as we move out into 2030, 50% of U.S. natural gas production is going to come from shale. I mean, it's a huge number. And you have to try to imagine what might have happened if that 50% wasn't available. That was all going to come from LNG. So as a result, these import terminals that we were built, I mean, you look at the list, are all going to be virtually empty. I mean, so empty that some companies are talking about whether or not they could reverse them to export the natural gas to China, because China's going to use all the gas, which I'll show you, right? And then, but indeed, had we, and we did a counterfactual under funding from the U.S. Department of Energy, had the shale never gone beyond this area of north of Dallas called the Barnett. Let's say it was too expensive, they didn't have any breakthroughs, it just wasn't going to be competitive in terms of price. Because what happened is somebody invested in the Barnett shale because they believed the peak oil thing, and so they believed that natural gas prices were going to stay above $10 per million BTU, and that didn't happen. But somebody invested, and then as the natural gas price started to fall, because where it's a cyclical industry, and oil will never stay at 100 because it's never forever. Nothing in the energy industry is ever forever. And that's because there'll be technology either on the use side or on the supply side. So once I had the technology and now the price is going to come down, I keep experimenting with the technology so that I can do it cheaper and cheaper, and I look in other places. So we did a scenario where we turned the clock back. And we said, suppose none of the shale had ever been developed, what would it look like moving forward? And you can see this is all the LNG that would have been imported, up to almost 10 TCF would have been imported into these terminals. So a totally different picture. Now, here's the interesting thing. It's not just a U.S. phenomenon. These shales are all around the world. And it's going to affect countries that never dreamed, we have a research project here at UT, countries that never dreamed they could be a natural gas producer and possibly exporter, like Poland, right? Argentina, right? There are going to be countries that people don't think of as energy producers that are going to become energy producers, and they're in very interesting geopolitical spaces. So one of the things that just the outlook for the U.S. shale gas and some of the known resources abroad means is that we are not going to be relying heavily on Middle East gas, for your adult lifetime. We're just not going to need a lot of natural gas from the Middle East, right? And I'll tell you what it means specifically. Those countries that did not develop their natural gas industry quickly, like Iran, for example, are going to have no opportunity to be a natural gas supplier in the market, period. It's over for the Iranians. They missed the window. Even if tomorrow they change their government and announce they want to be a major exporter of natural gas, the market is so overcrowded now that there's something called the first mover advantage, that they have to wait for the market to grow 30 years before they could find someone to buy their gas. So it's a major, major change, and the people it's going to hit, besides the Iranians, are going to be the Russians, right? So here's the outlook for the Russians. They're going to go from being 30, right? Last year or the year before, they were 37% of natural gas supply to Europe, and they had this leverage over the European countries. I mean, no one wants to get up in the morning and find out the Russians cut off your natural gas and you're all going to be sitting in the dark and the cold, right? They're going to go down to only 12% of the market, right? Which is already just knowing that has dramatically changed the relationship between the Europeans and the Russians, right? Just having the Russians know that they don't have that leverage. And the Russians are now sort of, in my opinion, having this sort of crisis of identity. So they thought they had this lever in the energy, and it was going to make them important again on the world stage, besides the fact that they, to sort of counter the fact that they had sort of a declining military, right? And now all of a sudden, Poland has shale gas, and Lower Saxony, Germany has shale gas, and the UK has shale gas, and the France banned their shale gas, but they have it and could turn it back on if they wanted it, right? And the United States has shale gas, and the Chinese have shale gas. So now you're the Russians, and you're not only competing with Qatar and Nigeria, right? But you're in Indonesia. You're competing with your actual customers. In the gas markets, you've no leverage whatsoever. And you're seeing that changing. One of the things that's happening in Russia, in my opinion, is because this card that they tried to play or wanted to play has not worked out, they're sort of imploding internally, right? Because people internally can't decide how to manage that. And so you're getting fractures within the ruling establishment, all of which have some stake or ownership in energy companies all through the Russian system. The interesting thing that everybody who's an LNG exporter in the world, after I speak with all of you, I'm going to fly off to Qatar. I was just over the weekend in Trinidad, right? Everybody's counting on the same thing. We can't sell it to the United States anymore, so we're going to sell it to China, right? And right now, China looks like it's going to be the replacement market. And the interesting thing about that is that the Chinese use a lot of oil in uses that you could switch to natural gas. They use oil for making petrochemicals. They use naphtha, which is a oil-based fuel. They use oil in their electricity sector, which those of you may not know, we don't use any oil to generate electricity in the United States, or not too much. So the question, if the Chinese develop their own gas, and I'll get to that. So the unconventionals are really changing the global energy landscape in terms of really reducing the power of some of these exporters might have had over different consuming countries. But the other thing that's really interesting about where these shale resources are is that they're in the Americas. There's just huge resources in the Americas, and that's where this technical phenomenon started. And so even though it may someday get to China, and I'll show you some slides what that'll look like, the answer is the here and now is it's here now in the Americas. You've got oil companies coming back and bringing their dollars back into the United States that might have previously taken those dollars and invested them abroad, right? And it's going to have interesting implications. So And it's not just natural gas. And I think that that's the important and interesting thing. It's turning out, so first it was natural gas, and we're going to have a lot of it. And you all know, you can all see it in your electricity bill, right? I mean, the price of natural gas, when I was driving, only here in Texas could you see the natural gas price changing on a billboard on your way in the car. So I can tell you that at some point when I was driving down here at 11 in the morning, the price of natural gas on the NYMEX was $2.30, because that's what it posts. I mean, it is incredible, okay? But the interesting thing is, there's oil. So when they first were doing this gas, it was, it's dry gas, but it's going to be very important. And, if you want to, make a story, you could say, because someday you could have an electric car, and we could generate the electricity with the natural gas we have right here in America, and it won't have as many emissions consequences as using coal, and it could be cleaner, and it could be better, and we have so much gas, and Canada has so much gas, and if the Mexicans would ever organize themselves, they have the Eagle Ford. There's so much gas, we could just, all the gas we need is going to be right here at home. But then somebody said, well, listen, if you can use this thing to do this gas in the Barnett and the Haynesville, where we can do, produce this gas with shale for, $2.50, what about going back to North Dakota and try to do the Williston Shale and produce oil? Well, guess what? They were successful. Okay, so it's very hard to know. It's a very early play, right? So it's a couple hundred, I think 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day of oil is now being produced in North Dakota, right? It's one of the fastest growing states in the United States, believe it or not, adding jobs. But here's the interesting thing. Not only are some analysts projecting that we could produce as much as 1.2 million barrels a day of oil in North Dakota, but it turns out the Eagle Ford play is not dry. Turns out there's oil liquids in the Eagle Ford right here in Texas, and the Texas onshore production is going to go up. So again, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but the conservative figures are that maybe the Eagle Ford can produce 450,000 barrels a day. So I'm making this presentation, I'm using this slide to a group that drills in the Eagle Ford. And they say, Mrs. Jaffe, we think your estimate's way too low. There could be 1 million barrels a day in the Eagle Ford alone. And now the companies are going to the Niobrara play in the Permian Basin, and they're also finding that they can produce oil in those places too. So CERA, which is one of the big consultants in the industry, they're saying that they think by the 2020s that U.S. production from shales will be 3 million barrels a day. I mean, there's a lot of oil. If you add to that what people were expecting to come up futuristically from the Gulf of Mexico, and then you subtract what the 2007 CAFE standards should take off of demand, especially if you all buy a more fuel-efficient car and stop driving around in inefficient cars, right? We could wind up absolutely trimming our imports by more than 50%, right? Which is just unbelievable, because in my lifetime, I never thought we'd ever go in this direction, right? And the interesting thing is you have to cheat, okay? But if you go out to like 2020 or 2025 and you throw in our biofuels production, the United States can return to being the biggest energy producer, so oil and gas, in the world, which is unbelievable. So I'm going to tell you guys a historical fact. In the 1960s and into the early 1970s, now you think about Saudi Arabia as being the only country out there that can put extra oil in the market, right? But you know what country used to play that role? The United States used to play that role in the 1960s. And it was the Texas Railroad Commission and the Oklahoma Commission that would decide how much we would shut in and how much we would add to the market in a crisis. So it's very interesting to think about the United States going back to a role. It's hard to even imagine ourselves as a world power that would not be worried all the time about where we're going to get our energy imports from. I mean, imagine a world where we're just not thinking about that when we're setting up our foreign policy. And I would argue with people. People say, well, geez, maybe that means we wouldn't be involved in global affairs anymore, we'd be isolationists. I say no. The answer is we are constrained now because we can't do this or we can't do that because that might disrupt our oil supply. But imagine if we didn't have to worry about that constraint and we had the aspirations, the values we had and the aspirations we have, and we'd be a greater economic power. That'll be another lecture about, but we're not going to be shipping so much money abroad. We're going to have a much better trade balance, right? And that's going to affect our ability to serve again as an economic power. That's going to help the value of our dollar relative to other currencies. So there's all kinds of positives that can come from this that are beyond just, will the price for, your electricity bill or your gasoline bill be effective. So when we think of unconventionals, we also need to think about unconventionals that are oil shale. So in other words, not shale rock. That's not a rock. Not shale formations, but the actual Carrigan oil that sits sort of near the surface of the ground. So again, it's a huge potential. DOE and Interior have announced the first leases for this year for this oil shale. And, it's environmentally challenging, so I'm not saying it's a cakewalk. I don't know if this resource will ever be produced, right? But the companies, if they continue to make progress and we get the regulation right so that we can produce this resource without less water or with less damage, or footprint, we're talking about a lot of oil. So, and then we have Brazil, a lot of oil. So the Americas really could be the new Middle East in a way, in terms of its importance to global energy supply. So let's just review geopolitical, my last couple of minutes, geopolitical implications. We're not going to be an importer in gas. We're going to reduce Russia's geopolitical footprint. One of the other countries, ironically, that's going to get hurt from the shale phenomenon is going to be Venezuela, which has a lot of resources that the market's not going to need. We're going to have less competition with the Chinese. So the necessity to have the United States and China in some kind of a geopolitical competition over quote-unquote scarce energy resources goes away, right? And most interestingly, from the point of view of today's news, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when people they're thinking they needed the natural gas and oil from Iran, the Iranians would use that to do what I call energy diplomacy. In other words, I'm trying to get sanctions on Iran, or I'm trying to restrict their foreign policy, and they're going to somebody and saying, well, if you want our natural gas, you have to veto the United States at the UN. Well, now that's pretty hard to get anybody to do because everybody can see that your resources aren't coming to market. So nothing certain, especially outside the United States, but even in the United States, we have regulatory issues with water quality, with resource management regulations. We have to worry about watershed protection. In other places like Argentina and Mexico and China, where there's a lot of shale that could be very attractive, they don't have the sort of market structure we had here in the United States. So you've got monopolies, you've got subsidized prices, which makes it hard to bring something to market commercially. They don't have regulatory transportation, so somebody, the government owns the pipeline, there's not equal access to it. There's land right issues right here in the United States. You're living in South Texas, you want to sell your backyard, you can. You're living in China, it's not like there's natural gas under your yard, it's not like you can sell it to some landman. So very different kind of issues that may either slow the pace of shale development abroad or maybe make it so that it doesn't ever come to fore. But so just to give you an idea, in the simulation, if we just have sort of a business as usual, the shale becomes about 15% of China's domestic production by 2040. But if the Chinese government were to decide that this shale thing, they're very serious about it, they want to move forward, and there have been some announcements in China about that, and they're now doing their first pilot project to have more market-based pricing, and they've lifted some of they've lifted price controls on shale, right, shale gas. Look at how much their imports shrink, their LNG imports shrink. So they have a dramatic impact on the whole global price structure for natural gas if China was to develop its own shale. And, who would be most hurt in that scenario? Iran, Venezuela, Qatar, and Russia. So I think that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what this resource can mean in terms of altered geopolitics and in terms of our relationships with different countries. If we think about our relationship with the countries in the Middle East and what our position is going to be trying to help support populations in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, you can see that having our own resources really gives us a little bit more freedom of movement in terms of thinking about the consequences, because the consequence of not having oil from the Middle East in a situation where we didn't have our own resources would have been much more dire than it might be now. And just to sort of leave you with sort of a bigger picture thought, right? Especially because your students are interested in energy. So, every 5 or 10 years, because energy investment is cyclical, right? It takes a lot of capital and there's a lag time. Price goes up, I see that there's a shortage, I start to make the investment. By the time my investment comes on, maybe the economic conditions are completely different, so you have a price collapse, right? And this has been happening since the 1800s. And every time it happens, every time the price goes to $100, you get people going to come out and tell you the reason we're at $100 is because we ran out of resource. And then when we go down to $30, or in the old days $8, it's like, you know what, it's going to be $8 forever. You don't need a fuel efficient car. You don't need to insulate your home. You can have a 50,000 square foot house. It doesn't matter. And that is equally not true, right? So, but the interesting thing to me, watching it over time, is that every time we have one of these crises, and I will say that it is my personal philosophy and belief that the reason the price of energy moves around is above the ground, right? The risks that get portrayed into the price that you pay for energy is above the ground. And if you look at the history of the oil industry, it's above the ground, right? So people are always coming out and telling you that the problem is below the ground. And maybe I'm too big a believer in technology, but this is the paradigm, okay? We have a problem above the ground and the price of energy goes up. I'm sitting in the Middle East or Russia or someplace like that, and I say, ha-ha, my moment has arrived. I am now going to be powerful. I have this resource that everybody needs. You can't make a war without fuel, right? So it has strategic value as well as just its value to an economy that wants to grow. And you have this aha moment in the Middle East. And I'll tell you guys a true story. I'm out giving a lecture like this in Qatar, the Berkeley conference, right, that UCLA puts on in Qatar every year. And the foreign minister's in the front row, raises his hand, because I'm, of course, predicting that I'm talking about how it's a cycle, and I'm saying that the price is going to go up and then it's going to bring in new technology, right? And some of that new technology is going to be in your car, and some of that new technology is going to be in the hands of oil companies from Texas. And I'm explaining that, and the price at that time was about, I don't know, $60, $70 a barrel. Guy raises him, Mrs. Jaffe, I have a question for you, he says, couldn't we here in the Middle East, right today, get a higher price for our oil? Aren't we giving too low a price for our oil? And I'll tell you how I answered this question. I said to him, what generation are you speaking about? Because he's in his 70s. I said, sir, are you speaking about your generation, your son's generation, or your grandson's generation? Because if I don't know which generation you're concerned with, I cannot answer your question correctly. I said, because if you're concerned about your generation, you can get $100. I said, but I'm telling you, your son will come to see $30 because of that choice, because everybody in America will get a car that, is dual switching or, gets 50 miles to the gallon. That would shave 50 miles to the gallon, shaves 5 million barrels a day off of U.S. oil demand, right? If everybody had one. So, I try to explain that, in an Al Jazeera moment, I said, but for your grandson, I said, what's the law of technology? Who under 30 in this country has a landline, land telephone? No one. No one. Who has a phone that they carry around with them that's not a friggin' computer? No one. And how many people in 5 years are going to have a phone they can't watch TV on? No one. And once you have a phone you can watch TV on, why would you ever get something that you can just talk to your mother on? It's a superior technology. You're not going to go backwards. Same thing in energy. Once we can drill in shale, guess what? They're going to take that same horizontal drilling combined with this and that, and they're trying it in Saudi Arabia just to get more oil out of their existing fields. Right? And you know what? It's going to work. So my point to you is, the second you see this crisis, but you should still change your energy footprint use for other reasons, climate and otherwise, okay? Because we shouldn't waste energy. But the bottom line is, when that comes in, a technology comes in, an expensive technology like shale, where we thought we needed $10 natural gas prices to make it work, and then once the price comes down, because we go into a recession because the energy price is so high and it puts a burden on the economy, right? Then I got a bunch of people, people talk about the energy companies like they're these evil empires. But you know what? They're just a corporation filled with engineers, right? So once I come down to you and tell you if you don't want to lose your job, I need you to produce this field over here for $3 instead of $10. Guess what? You're an engineer. You figure it out. Now I'm in the Middle East. I'm in Qatar or Abu Dhabi. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, oh my God, they have $2.30 gas in the United States. What the hell am I going to do? And that's the crisis all over again. You know why? Because when the price comes down, now I don't have any money to spread out to my population. So now I fall from power, we have turmoil, and then the price goes back up. So I'm telling you all, my opinion is there's going to be more turmoil. It's going to affect your energy supply. When that happens, remember, technology, 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 right? Because it won't be forever. And each time we develop the technology, we come up with a way to do the same with less. We'd not, because we have a growing population, but we can take this growing population and this line that people said this population was going to produce never turns out to be the line that people said because of this technological element. So it's important that you all work on technology and keep doing math, right? But it's also important to understand that it's a cycle and how the pieces fit together. Okay.
We have time for some questions. Let me start by asking a question. Could you comment a little bit, Amy, on what types of adjustments are we seeing here today because of such a low price of gas? In terms of new industries coming up, where is the gas industry looking to generate new demand, looking out to the future?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of interesting things. And again, because it's a cyclical industry, the question is which things come in and which ones don't. So the first and most obvious thing to do in a market where there's turmoil in the Middle East, so the price of oil is 100, but natural gas is $2.30, is to build plants that take natural gas and turn it into oil, right? That's called Gtl Gas-to-Liquids. And indeed, you see a lot of the major oil companies now looking to put these GTL plants here in Texas and Louisiana. That could be a very interesting thing, right? The second thing you hear a lot about, and then you've all worked on it here at UT, is can I put the natural gas into your car, right? And what would I do to convert your car, your existing car, or whether I could sell you a natural gas car? And there's two technologies now, because there's a technology that puts CNG, which some of you may be more familiar with, but in China they're starting to experiment with taking LNG and putting it in your car, right? So that's another place we might see natural gas go directly into the transportation system, especially for things like, which you're already seeing, natural gas buses for a city, or places where you don't have to worry about my driving home to Houston and will there be a natural gas refill station? Can I make it all the way home, right? So it'd be more, prevalent in fleets.
Why can't you make it hybrid?
Um,
Gasoline, natural gas.
I,
They have it in South America.
yeah, I mean, I think that you're going to see more of that. I personally am a big believer. I believe a little bit in government intervention. Not everybody does. And I believe that as a country, what we want is what we have in the electricity sector, which is, more fuels, right? We have all these different fuels we can use. So we want that in the transportation sector. So to the extent that I can have a car that's either dual oil and natural gas, or dual electricity and oil, or dual natural gas and electricity, the more I can switch from one thing to another, the more flexibility I have. And you can see that it's a little easier for someone from Houston to picture, because we've had the hurricanes and then suddenly you can't get fuel for your car. And we're not a city with public transportation, so you can instantly know what that means. Sometimes I do high school lectures, and I go into the kids and I say, do you remember during Hurricane Rita how you couldn't go anywhere? I said, imagine if Hugo Chavez of Venezuela or Vladimir Putin of Russia was deciding that for you. Instead of it just being a storm that someday somebody's going to fix, get the refineries back online, you're going to get your fuel again. Imagine if it was political. And would you go to war over that, and what would it mean? Right? So the more that no one can do that to us, right, because our cars run on more than one thing and we're not going to have the dislocation, the better we are. And it might have been hard to do in 73, and it might have been hard to do in 90, right? But, we are really close to the technology now, and so it is really important. And thinking about, how would we do it? Would people, how we get people to switch to that kind of car? It's a really interesting sort of policy puzzle, but a very important part of what we might do. And then, of course, there's the debate about whether or not we should export the natural gas, right, and make more money from it and sort of take prices off the bottom so it doesn't get shut in.
Question from the audience? Students get preference?
What's your prediction about oil shale or other unconventional oil resources?
So I'll tell you my prediction. It's a little cynical, right? My prediction is, if there's a major crisis in the Middle East, if we don't manage this conflict with Iran well, right, or there's some internal problem that develops in a major oil-producing country, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just Saudi Arabia. Politics are worse in Iraq, right? So a lot of places where we're getting a certain amount of oil that, if either all coagulated at once or just, the steady trickle of problems. Some of the Libyan oils come back online, but not as much as they're producing. So if that happens, over several countries, and we get to the point where there's really a crisis, right? Then I think we've had the luxury to talk about environmental impact, and we need to keep the dialogue on environmental impact. But in the end, for you students, I tell the story. Somebody asked me once, how did you get into this? And I didn't really have a good explanation for how I fell into being, an oil analyst. And then somebody was doing this exercise after September 11 for my kids. My kids are your age now, right? And they were in middle school after September 11. They had a social studies teacher that did this exercise about how major events that happen when you're that age can affect how you view the world later on. And they were supposed to go around and interview members from different generations in their family about what was the major event when they were in middle school. And I'd never thought about it. And don't you guys do the math. But I was in middle school in 1973. And I'll tell you what, you can hear from my accent, I grew up in a small town outside of Boston, 5,000 people. And we were next to another town of 5,000 people, because that's how New England is. And there was one gasoline station for 3 towns. And my father commuted to Boston. A lot of people, worked in the local community, but he commuted to Boston. And he you got this thing. You could only buy gas on Tuesdays and Thursdays if you had an odd number license plate. And my mother was a special ed teacher, so she didn't take me to school. So if I didn't want to walk in the snow, I had to go with my father at 5 o'clock in the morning and wait for the gasoline, and then he'd drop me off and we were done. And I tell people, it made such an impact on me, I've been writing about friggin' OPEC for 30 years. Right? So, I'm hoping for you all that you don't, 30 years from now, one of you is not giving this lecture. But my point to you is, in that moment when it's really a crisis, I think the lesson of the Macondo for me was that if we tell the oil industry they have to have a crisis profile, they have to have a containment vessel, so if they have a blowout, it gets shut down in one day. And it only took them 6 months to come up with it. I feel like if we tell them, you have to remove or lower the risk for the following 5 things that happen when you do fracking, I think they can do it. That is my opinion. I think they can come up with a fracking fluid that's non-toxic, right? I think they can come up with better practices for water disposal. I think a lot of these things are solvable if we demand that they're solved. And you're going to want it solved because when you wake up in the morning, if there's a conflict with Iran, you're going to want to use your car, right? You just are. That's why I started the lecture that way, because people think all kinds of things when they're not thinking about using their car, right? But if you want to use your car and there's going to be a crisis in the Middle East, then all of a sudden, because we have the technology to drill for oil shale, it'll make more sense to do it, right? Because we're going to need the oil, right? And if you students don't like that future, rather than placard the Keystone Pipeline, which is going to be the only oil you have to put in your car, is going to be this oil from Canada, okay? You need to demand policies where we are, that force us all to have self-control and use less. That's where the policy should be coming from. This thing of what your car mileage gets is such a powerful tool. We could cut imports in half just by having a car that gets 50 miles to the gallon. We can do that. The technology is almost there. You need to demand that.
So first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation. Hey, if we get all this coming online, the oil supplies, do you think we'll get to energy security, energy independence, or actually being a swing producer again, first of all? Second of all, the reason I made the comment is, you're right, there's 240.8 million vehicles in the U.S. and there's 20,000 electric vehicles, but the technology's there.
Right.
And so it's not hard for me in my 21st century vehicle to get well over 250 miles a gallon or go 4 months on one tank of gas, 3,860 versus last century's hybrid technology. So the technology's there. It may get undercut if we get too low of oil prices.
Right.
So if that happens, then it'll swing. Third thing is you're in great company with Dan Yergin agreeing that we're not going to run out and it's all above ground. So thank you again. But do you think we'll get to which tier of security, independence, or swing producer do you think we'll get if we have all these things line up?
So it depends on these guys. It depends on what you want. For the first time in 30 years, I do really believe that if your generation were to use energy differently, we could be independent. I think that's actually achievable. But it have to come on the demand side. Like, you can't just count on this oil coming out. And the oil's not forever, you know what I mean? So the whole point about not blocking oil now because of emissions is to use the resources we have now and then take the money from it and use that money to get to the car you're speaking about, right? Right. Well, maybe it's too expensive today for most Americans, right? So the point is, of course, people say everybody likes I'm very popular when I'm giving a speech because I'm not running for office. If I was running for office, you'd all heckle me. But there's a very simple solution. It's very, very simple. We need to tax oil, right? We just need to tax oil. Not the little tax we have now. Do you know what I mean? Because if what it is it's so convenient, right? Well, if it was more expensive, it wouldn't be so convenient. Then, you'd make the extra investment to buy a car even if it's a little more expensive. So, but how do you get that car to be less expensive? You have to take the money from this tax that we're going to put on the oil, and while you're using less because it's more expensive, you can also take some of that money and put it in R&D. And let me tell you something about R&D, right? Because Solyndra not aside, because of course that was not a good decision. But sometimes you're gonna have a bad decision. But here's the bottom line: this shale technology that is now producing your $2.30 gas, and meaning we don't have to worry about the Russians, and the Germans don't have to worry about the Russians, and we can tell the Iranians where to go, and all that. Okay, that was a DOE-funded project under Jimmy Carter. So everybody makes fun of Jimmy Carter, and he came on TV with the sweater and told everybody to put the thermostat down, and we stopped doing that R&D because wasted all this money on syn fuels and all these things that didn't work. Well, you know what? They all worked. There was a project in the Appalachia on shale drilling, and that's why we have this technology now that's been made Texas a rich state again, right? So that's all from government R&D. I really believe strongly in government R&D. And I really think that it has to be the combination. Like, you can't just say, well, we have a lot now, so we're going to stop. No. You have to keep doing the R&D because at some later stage you're going to have a new technology if you're going to keep using energy at the same rate. But if you were to stop using energy at the same rate and do the R&D, then you'd really be somewhere. Then you'd be a global power in every sense of the word. Economic, jobs, promising future, better climate, better planet, safer water, right? That to me is sort of the paradigm of where you want to go.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask. I'm personally not ready to, I guess, celebrate just yet that shale gas is going to reduce power in Russia and all these other places. And I'll give you a few examples. First, in Poland. Poland and Russia are tied with gas contracts up to the late 2030s and early 2040s, and I know contracts in many ways are way to be broken, but the political structure there really is still tied in many respects to the Russian Soviet heritage. In Ukraine, the main gas companies, like for Rosenergo is 50% owned by Gazprom, and then the rest are owned by a lot of Ukrainian Russian oligarchs. So if shale gas were to start there, very good chance Russia could just usurp the money there. And third is the case of Bulgaria, which just banned shale gas fracking and put a moratorium on that. And from information from the Jamestown Foundation, Russian sources have influenced public opinion to get that banned in many respects. So my question is, seeing that areas like Russia and through Al Jazeera, Qatar, and other places are not lying down, they're trying to defend against shale gas and shale oil. Is this? I mean, are there abilities to fight back against this really just all for naught, or do we really have to look at them and say, this may not although they can't keep this forever, that we really have to watch the defenders of conventional old technologies?
So what I would say is this. Everything you said is true. Nothing's a straight line. But the market has a certain amount of momentum. So if they never did shale in Europe, there's no shale in Europe, and it was just the United States and China, there would be so much gas that's not needed from Russia and Qatar and Iran and so forth that it still changes the whole market dynamic. The question is leverage. How much leverage do I have, right? And, Poland has to make its choice for itself, right? But even if Poland doesn't do its shale gas, Poland was already getting out somewhat from under the Russians by having an LNG receiving terminal from Qatar, right? But if I don't have choices, if I can't play one supplier off another, then I get nothing. But in the gas market, there's something called the contract for differences market, right? So as long as I have it doesn't even have to be a perfectly global market for gas, but as long as I have these alternative suppliers, right? I mean, what's happened? the Russians had to go to 20% of what we call a gas-on-gas price, right? So they had to discount their prices already to hold their market in Europe, right? The more that happens, as more and more LNG is distressed because it can't, say Argentina comes on. So say it doesn't happen in Poland because the KGB, pays off people, and it doesn't happen in Poland, or it doesn't happen in Bulgaria because, Gazprom funded, Gasland to be shown all over Bulgaria, right? I mean, maybe it'll happen in Argentina. And then that gas will go to Russia's customers, right? So when you have so much resource, I mean, I can't, people said, well, we're going to shut it down here in the United States. Well, suppose we do shut it down in New York and Pennsylvania. Though in Pennsylvania, honestly, they're talking about building fertilizer plants and bringing in new manufacturing and all kinds of industry based on their gas. So I'm not sure that, DIMIC is going to be enough to shut it down. I really think there's shutting it down and there's re-regulating it properly, right? So, and I don't know where the variable is going to be. If it turns out we're having earthquakes all around the United States and people's homes are falling down, yeah, it's going to get shut down, okay? So, maybe it's a little too early to make a pronouncement, but it's sort of like there's so much resource this way, right? So I tell people that, you hear these estimates that there's 1,000 TCF in North America, right? So when the Baker Institute does its simulations, we only use 600 TCF. And we used to do the simulations with 300 TCF, and we still got the same results. Why? Because it's so big. And you're talking about a 20-year period. I mean, you just can't use that much resource. Even at a lower recovery rate. I mean, there's just only so much resource that can be produced at a time and come into the market at a time. So I just still think it's going to be very impactful. And you'd have to get every country in the world to stop using it. So if you think about how destructive coal can be to health. I mean, here in the United States, we're blowing off the top of mountains, right? The mercury that comes out of producing coal in the plant near your house, if any of you live in someplace near a coal plant, let me tell you something, because we had a panel at Rice. Whatever happens to the people who live near Fukushima, it is less radiation than if they were living next to a coal plant. I swear to God. It's more mercury, more pollutants, and no one can shut down coal anywhere in the world, even though we know it's a bad idea, right? So you're telling me that some political momentum is going to come on top of this shale gas that can't happen to coal? I don't see it, especially because the shale gas is creating jobs at a time when everybody wants jobs. So it even has that, sort of protective barrier around it that coal has, this protective barrier of the jobs, right? So I still don't feel like, I understand the phenomenon, and you're right, but I just feel like because it's so extensive and in so many different locations, the chances of somebody shutting it down everywhere, it doesn't have to just be shut down in Europe to have the Russians become unpowerful. Having it be fully developed in Canada, and then the Canadians are sending it somewhere, or in Argentina, and then they're sending it somewhere, means that the Russians will not have leverage. As long as the Europeans have LNG receiving terminals, which people said they wouldn't build for environmental reasons, and 19 LNG receiving terminals were built, right? So that's why it gets to your question. In the end, if you're going to get up in the morning and turn on your lights and drive your car, you're going to have to stomach some environmental contamination. And the question is, how much and what kind? And that's really what we need to be, as Americans, what we need to be debating is what level of pollution is acceptable and what level of pollution can I get rid of and still have an active economic lifestyle. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, right? And the debate gets sidetracked when we pretend that we don't care how much energy we have or what it costs, because we don't really feel that way. Even the people with the placards for Keystone Pipeline, seriously, how did they get there to Nebraska? They came in an airplane, they drove in their car. They did not bicycle to Nebraska to protest that pipeline. I'm sorry, I hate to be so cynical, but I mean, that's really, to me, the bottom line, and why, when we think about energy and we think about the scale in which we use it, we could be independent And if that was so, we so decide now, we have that opportunity now, but it's going to take both changing the way we use it and then, stomaching and moderating a certain amount of pollution to produce it.